On April 17, 2006, on the 20th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, wrote, "The nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl, even more than my launch of perestroika, was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union 5 years later. Indeed, the Chernobyl catastrophe was a historic turning point. There was the era before the disaster, and there is the very different era that has followed." That sentence was not just a reflection on history, but also a haunting confession from the man who once led a superpower. But why? Soviet Union, 1985. In 1985, Gorbachev walked into the Kremlin under the eyes of the whole world. In his hands was an empire that had once made the West tremble, but now it was rotting within. The economy was stagnating. Heavy industry was outdated. Ration coupons still existed, even though they clearly showed how ineffective the system was. As the man responsible for a vast empire, Gorbachev knew that if nothing changed, the Soviet Union would collapse. It wouldn't take a war. The weight from within would bring it down. So, he decided to reform the whole system. Right away, 2 major campaigns were launched. The first was glasnost, which means openness. The government wanted people to speak the truth and talk openly about social issues. The goal of glasnost was to build a transparent Soviet society where people could discuss, criticize, and take part in reforms. Next came perestroika, which means restructuring. Gorbachev wanted to rebuild the Soviet economy. That meant letting factories manage their own money, opening the door to private cooperatives, and encouraging new technology. He did everything, hoping for positive change, a push to move the Soviet Union forward. But the reality was much more complicated. Perestroika threw the economy into chaos. Inflation soared. Goods were hard to find. The black market grew out of control. Meanwhile, glasnost made people confused and distrustful of the government. They thought about the pointless deaths in war and started asking hard questions. Soon after, Gorbachev traveled across the country, meeting all kinds of people to gather feedback and bring hope to the people. But then, Chernobyl exploded. What happened at Chernobyl? On the morning of April 26, 1986, Gorbachev received the first report. There was an incident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The extent of the damage was still unclear. No one mentioned a reactor explosion. There was no exact number of casualties. Immediately, the Politburo was called. A government committee was urgently formed and sent to the site, led by Deputy Prime Minister Boris Sherbina. Also present at Chernobyl were civilians and firefighters, but no one brought protective equipment. It wasn't because they were careless, but because they didn't know what they were facing. In reality, radioactive smoke had already spread across Ukraine, Belarus, parts of Russia, and beyond the border into Europe. In Kiev, just 130 kilometers from Chernobyl, the May Day parade on May 1st still went on as usual. Children waved flags in the air filled with radioactive dust. On April 28th, Sweden detected abnormal radiation levels at the Forsmark power plant. They sent a notice asking for an explanation. At first, the Soviet Union denied it. Only after Sweden suggested they would file an official report to the International Atomic Energy Agency did the Soviet government admit that an accident had occurred at Chernobyl. On one page of the workers' newspaper, a major Soviet paper at the time, dated April 29, 1986, the yellow part was one of the first notices about the Chernobyl disaster. The white part, which was much bigger, was about a chess tournament. Meanwhile, on Komsomolskaya Pravda, the official paper of the Communist Youth League, in the same issue dated April 29, 1986, there was no mention of Chernobyl on the front page. Now, look at the contrast. This is the New York Daily News. Or a German newspaper with a bold red headline, Chernobyl, the campaign of lies. According to the Soviet Union, it was not about hiding anything, just that they didn't have full information yet. Gorbachev really did launch Glasnost to speak the truth, but in the early days, he had no truth to tell. However, delayed information was only part of the problem. Too many issues forced them to face the truth. First, the casualties. Early news reports said only 2 people died. 7 firefighters died from radiation exposure, and 299 were hospitalized with strange symptoms. But in reality, hospitals were full of people with severe radiation burns, hair loss, vomiting, and bone marrow failure. Doctors had to write in their records that they had vegetative vascular dystonia. The turning point came at a meeting on July 3, 1986, led by Deputy Prime Minister Boris Sherbina, when internal reports were brought straight to the Politburo. The design of reactor number 4, RBMK, had serious flaws, but the warning documents were classified, so the operators were never allowed to read them. Mistakes during the test, combined with turning off the safety system, caused the reactor to suddenly increase power, boil off coolant, and finally explode. That meant a real nuclear disaster had happened. 2 engineers died on the spot. 28 more died later from acute radiation exposure. Pripyat, one of the most modern towns in the Soviet Union, had to be evacuated 36 hours later. The truth was clear, but they still chose to hide it, or at best, delay it. Admitting the design flaw meant denying Soviet scientific prestige and technical power. Not to mention, who would be held responsible? Who would resign? One personal mistake could bring down the whole system. Their bureaucratic nature, fear of responsibility, and strict control of information made them afraid to go public even when the truth was obvious. It wasn't until May 14th, 18 days later after the disaster, that Gorbachev appeared on national television. The authorities admitted it was a serious incident. But at the time, he criticized the West for exaggerating the situation and smearing the Soviet Union's honor. Soviet ambassadors in other countries also spoke up. For example, in the UK.
What about the reports over here, Ambassador, that several thousand people have been killed in the accident? That's not true.
That's not.
He didn't just talk about Chernobyl as a normal disaster, but connected it to a bigger message about Soviet foreign policy. He argued that if a small accident like Chernobyl could cause such terrible damage, then a nuclear war with thousands of bombs would be unimaginable. Gorbachev implied that nuclear powers needed to cooperate more, reduce nuclear weapons, and avoid conflict to prevent an even bigger disaster. This matched Gorbachev's foreign policy goals to ease tensions with the West. In other words, Gorbachev was steering international opinion so that the story of nuclear disarmament and cooperation between world powers could overshadow the real disaster that had happened in the Soviet Union. But the world did not trust Moscow. Western media said that the Soviet Union was hiding the real scale of the accident, that the government downplayed the seriousness and described it as a minor issue under control. That official reports were vague, shallow, and didn't reflect the real situation. One newspaper even only showed pictures of leaders visiting the plant, instead of reporting on the dead land, or the radioactive smoke spreading across the continent. People began to doubt not just the accident, but the whole system. The openness that Gorbachev hoped for now backfired on him. Chernobyl, in the end, was not just a nuclear disaster. It was a disaster of trust, a seed of collapse for the superpower that Gorbachev was hopelessly trying to rebuild. Why was Chernobyl a trigger for the collapse? First, we have to talk about trust. Right when the disaster happened, Gorbachev's system did not act according to glasnost, but acted like in the Stalin era. They remained silent, covered things up, and lied. From the beginning, the government said that it was a small technical issue that was already under control. But in reality, a large area was contaminated with radiation.
Asked for detailed information with regard to the nature and the scope of the catastrophe so that we can take the right actions to take care of all our own people here. We have so far not received an answer.
The government was willing to let them die as long as it could save face. In Ukraine, Belarus, and even Russia, anger spread fast. In November 1988, academic Andrei Sakharov wrote a letter directly to Gorbachev to express his frustration about the lack of transparency. At the same time, he also said that a nuclear engineer who took part in handling the incident had written a publication about the Chernobyl disaster. However, the publication was blocked and not allowed to be published. This went against Gorbachev's glasnost. While the crisis of trust was rising, the economic burden of Chernobyl started dragging the Soviet Union to the bottom. Initial cleanup and recovery costs were estimated at 18 billion rubles, equal to about $6 billion today. But that was just the beginning. Over 330,000 people had to be evacuated. Millions of hectares of farmland were abandoned. The healthcare system was overwhelmed. In Belarus alone, later estimates put the damage at up to $235 billion. Meanwhile, oil prices dropped. The war in Afghanistan continued to eat up billions of rubles every year, and state-run businesses kept losing money. The Soviet Union had no more money for reforms, no more resources to rebuild, and no more time to wait. Chernobyl was like pulling the oxygen tube from a dying patient. But Chernobyl didn't just harm the economy. It also awakened historical wounds and national pride that had been suppressed for decades. So, the Ruk movement in Ukraine and Sąjūdis in Lithuania began to rise and quickly turned into democratic and independence movements. Slogans moved from protecting health to protecting the nation, protecting freedom, and they all opposed the central government. In the end, after Chernobyl, the whole world saw the Soviet Union differently. Before, they feared its nuclear power, space technology, and military strength. But now, they only saw a slow, dangerous, and out-of-control giant. Not only the West, but even Eastern European allies began to doubt the Soviet model. The Soviet Union lost its credibility, both at home and abroad. Of course, when talking about the fall of the Soviet Union, no one understood it better than Gorbachev. That Chernobyl was not the only cause. The economy had already been weak. The war in Afghanistan was long, costly, and hopeless. Ethnic tensions were brewing inside the Union. Meanwhile, the arms race with the US, from strategic lasers to mid-range missiles, was draining the budget day by day. And Chernobyl was the shot to the heart of the Soviet Union. Not just because of economic damage or political conflict, but because it destroyed the most fragile thing any regime needs to survive: its trust. Gorbachev once believed openness could bring a new beginning. But Chernobyl became living proof that the system couldn't tell the truth. At least, not at the time. Even when timely truth could have saved many lives. The aftermath of Chernobyl. A few months after the Chernobyl disaster, Gorbachev kept steering the sinking ship called the Soviet Union, but none of it worked. In December 25, 1991, Gorbachev officially resigned. State television showed Gorbachev on camera, holding his resignation letter as president of the Soviet Union. It was not just the end of a term, but the official collapse of an empire that lasted 69 years. Gorbachev left politics, but Chernobyl never ended. It was only the beginning of a tragedy that would last for generations. By 2025, the areas around Chernobyl are still closed off. A zone more than 2,600 square kilometers wide became unlivable, not because of war, but because of radiation. Every forest fire, every strong wind can still carry radioactive dust back to homes that seemed safe. Cleaning and restoring the area is expected to last until 2065. Millions of people live with invisible fear because of drinking milk from cows that ate radioactive grass right after the accident. Many children absorbed high doses of radiation. It went straight to their thyroid glands and later developed into cancer. More than 4,000 thyroid cancer cases were diagnosed between 1992 and 2002, and that number later rose to nearly 5,000. Some models predict that there may be up to 16,000 thyroid cancer cases caused by Chernobyl. The number of disabled victims increased rapidly, from 40,106 in 1995 to 107,115 in 2018 in Ukraine. Former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan once said that more than 7 million people are still suffering every day because of Chernobyl, and at least 3 million children still need treatment. Thousands of people who were once heroes, who rushed in to stop the first fire, slowly passed away. They only left their names on memorials or in medical records that never healed. Even national budgets were never free from Chernobyl's shadow. Ukraine still spends nearly 7% of its yearly budget just to deal with the consequences of this disaster. Belarus has estimated its damages over 3 decades to be more than $200 billion. The final lesson is too clear. When a government lies in a crisis, the people will take back their loyalty. Chernobyl didn't just blow up a reactor. It leaked the entire truth that the regime had tried to hide. And when the truth floods out, the empire will fall. Not because of outside forces, but because of the rot inside.